we see the impact of positive leadership through the first-person perspective. So Nehemiah was a very positive, effective leader. And we see what leads to that. How do you become a positive, effective leader? And Nehemiah had those qualities, and we'll get to observe that. And then we'll also see how God blesses those with integrity. One of the fascinating things throughout this book that I appreciate is Nehemiah's enemies will throw an accusation, and it's almost like the narrative stops for a moment, and Nehemiah says, Lord, see what I've done because of who you are, and bless me for it. So one thing that he said is, I have never taken the governor's allotment of food. The 12 years I was in Jerusalem, Lord, see my integrity and bless me for it. See, he knew there was a hardship for the people, so I never took what was my right in order to help those people out. Even though he was feeding over 150 people a day, he never took from the people what was a right for the governor, because he felt like that would have been too much of a burden for them. So you see just that integrity and his asking God for help and God delivering that help. So I really appreciate this. And also, just from a side note, is he had integrity and things didn't always go right. But he always had God on his side. And that's something else we can see. So there's a lot of things that we see in this that I think are just really phenomenal to acknowledge. So in 2 verses 1 through 4, Nehemiah 2, 1 through 4, we see Nehemiah, he's finally going to move forward with his plan. The first step is a very daring step. If you look in, so he's the cupbearer to the king. He's in serving the king, and he takes a disposition that is noticeable. And the king notices, and it says in verse 4, so the king said to me, why is your face sad, though you are not sick? This is nothing more than sadness of the heart. And Nehemiah says, then I was very much afraid. This is important to just keep in mind. Who's Artaxerxes? You know, it's easy to read this, and just because it says the king, and we're kind of used to that being things said in the Bible, and we get comfortable with it. But if you go back to Ezra chapter 4, and I believe in verse, I probably have a note on this, I think it's verse 6. In Ezra 4:6, what it says is, that it's a letter addressed to Ezra. No, it's Ezra chapter 7 and verse 6. Somewhere. Anyway, somewhere in Ezra, or it's in the book of Ezra. Here, I'll look it up real quick. I think it is Ezra 7, maybe we'll start at 6. Ezra 7, verse 6, verse 12. Excuse me. Ezra 7:12. Artaxerxes, King of Kings. Just stop and think about that title for a moment. King of Kings. And where Artaxerxes sits in relative rank on earth. And he was the highest ranked person to live. He was the most powerful. He was the most preeminent. He was literally the ruler of the known world. So as far as his armies have conquered every other army, his whatever he said, he had power over life and death. He had power over rise and fall of nations. He was a powerful man. Just to put it into perspective. So here's Nehemiah, the cupbearer, and it's impressive that he, of all the servants and all, was the trusted one to protect the life of the king by ingesting poison on his behalf. That's where Nehemiah was. He had audience with the king, but if you remember in the book of Esther, Esther was the queen. And for her to go in and seek an audience with the king without being invited was a death sentence, unless he canceled the death sentence. So when Ezra gets the attention of the king in this way, it is likely a similar type of situation. And Ezra responded with, I was very much afraid. And I think what Mordecai said to Esther is, perhaps you were raised up for a moment such as this. And Nehemiah took the same step of faith. So you really see his faith. But here's the impressive thing. There could have been a great cost to Nehemiah in making this appeal to the ruler of the world. But he prayed about it, he prepared, and he moved forward. Now this is a pattern in Nehemiah's life. He prayed about it, he prepared for it, and he moved forward.
Yeah, apparently the people who waited on the king couldn't have even a sad face in the presence of royalty. That would have cost him his life.
Yeah.
If you show up with an unhappy face, a sad face, your days are numbered.
And
It's a big deal.
yeah, so it was a risk for sure. Mike?
You know, I never really thought about this aspect until you brought it up last Sunday, about the fact that, you know, his job, you know, wasn't just to serve wine. His job was to taste the wine. Well, how many guys did the king have that he could trust to a degree? I mean, so that you could see God's work here is the fact that the king was taking this guy, which he trusted with his own life, and was willing to let him go. So to me, that's kind of an amazing thing in itself, because it definitely had God's working.
And it speaks to the quality and integrity of Nehemiah's character. Because he wasn't, so the king trusted him to do that. So there's Nehemiah. He prayed, he had a preparation, and he moved forward. And that is the pattern of Nehemiah's, if you want to call it ministry or work, that's the pattern. He prays, he makes preparation, he moves forward. Here, he moves forward, even though it's scary, it could cost him his life, and he moves forward anyway. Then, verse 4, the king said to me, "What would you request?" Now this is interesting to me, because if you were going to ask the ruling tyrant of the entire earth to do something for you, how would you approach him?
Send an email
Maybe.
first.
Maybe, yeah. You would want to feel it out a little bit, right?
Exactly.
But just stop and think about that's an impressive situation. He says, "What would you do?" Which means he says, "Your desire is my desire. How do you want to see this? How are you going to see this through, Nehemiah? What do you want to do?" Who did Nehemiah ask first? He's seeking the blessing or the approval of the highest ranked person on earth. Who does he talk to first? He seeks the blessing and approval of the king of the creation. Now stop and think about that for a moment. Do we talk highly of Nehemiah's access? That's what we've been talking about. Nehemiah's access is impressive, and his integrity and all those things. What access do we have that we might take for granted or even ignore? There's no threat of death for us to make an appeal to the ruler of creation, but is that an avenue that we neglect in our life or take for granted or are very flippant about the way we deal with it in our life? And then stop and think, why? Why are we less reverent than Nehemiah when approaching Artaxerxes? And the answer is because God's not a tyrant. He's a loving God. He's a kind, merciful, gentle, accepting, and Father. And although He is King and He deserves our respect and our fear, He has proven His character and integrity to be approachable and safe. And you just want to stop and think about that for a moment, as we have an access greater than Nehemiah had with Artaxerxes. But God is not a tyrant like Artaxerxes was. And you see there's just a difference, and it's just something to stop and think about. Sometimes we might be afraid to approach our boss or even to talk to some stranger about Jesus. That might be intimidating. But how did Nehemiah deal with something like that? And you can follow the same pattern. You make preparations, you pray about it, you seek an opportunity, You ask God's permission, then you ask their permission. There's a process that Nehemiah went through, and it was a process that emphasized who God was and what he could do.
And he's probably just praying for the right words too and the right attitude, because you get nervous and things don't always come out right and stuff. And Paul gives us the same example in Ephesians about praying to God to utter words that are effective, and we can use those same things too. I think we get really afraid they're going to make fun of me or whatever. I'm not going to know what to say, and yet even Paul gives us an example of praying for the right words.
Yeah, and Paul, and not just Ephesians, also in Colossians. Like Paul, that was, and to me, Paul was one of the most effective evangelists, and he said, if you don't pray for me, that God gives me the right thing to say, that is what I am dependent on that. Nehemiah recognizes that as well. But that's also an example. That is an example of faithfulness from Nehemiah's perspective. If you can recreate this scenario in a lot of different places in life, and we can do that and seek God's blessing. But there's one thing that is critical in this that we need to take note of, and that is Nehemiah moved forward not knowing what the answer was going to be. Now, he made preparations. When the king says, how long is it going to take you? He says 12 years. Now, you can see that if you look forward a little bit in, I think my next slide. Okay, so my next slide, it says, how long will it take for you to return? If you look in Nehemiah, I believe it's chapter 12. Oh, Nehemiah 5:14 and 13:6. Both places, he says, it's been 12 years before he returned. So that's the definite time. He said, I gave a definite time. We learned in other places in the book, it was a 12-year period of time that he asked for. And when he was done, he went back to the king and he gave a report. So you see that Nehemiah had a plan up front. What are you going to need? So he's like, here's what I'm going to need. So that's a significant element of this is he said, what are you going to need? And he gave him what he needed. Now here's another thing, just a note as far as looking for the right opportunity. In verse 6 it says, the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, how long will your journey be and when will you return? That's an interesting note that he throws in there, the queen sitting beside him. Because with our wives, we bring our wives wherever we go. Like, I like having my wife with me when I go to meet new people or go to a gathering or whatever. I feel like that I like that better. But the Persians, especially the monarchs, if they had a public meeting, the wife didn't appear. The wife was someone you saw in private, not someone who was with you publicly. So because of that, when it says his wife was with him, Nehemiah didn't choose a time that put the king under, was not a public situation, it was a private ask. So it just kind of gives you a little bit of understanding. What setting did Nehemiah choose to make his appeal? It was one where he could be accepted or turned down without it being an embarrassment to the king or anything like that. So you see some wisdom in that as well. So he gave a definite time, and then he says, here's what I'm going to need. See, he did make preparations, and he gave him a list of needs and permissions. But in all of that, notice what he says in verse 8. And this is the end of verse 8. And the king granted them to me because the good hand of my God was on me. Now, notice the priority here. I'm going to ask God before I ask the king because God's a higher rank. And when it was permitted, it wasn't because the king was good, it was because God was good. Nehemiah acknowledged and gave thanks to God in everything he did. And this is a pattern for Nehemiah's life and leadership, is he always gives credit to God because he recognizes God's rank is higher. God's rank supersedes. So I want to take a moment, just look at this map we have here. So here is roughly, and I think probably a little bit, I have my route up here. I just wanted to measure, well, how far was it? Because we've talked about that a few times. My guess is, in fact, because if you zoom in a little bit, you see this little river, it's kind of running this way. It looks like a little crack in the rocks, but it seems like a pretty significant valley. The Euphrates River runs through there. And if you zoom in on Google Maps, it's all farmland all along the river. So likely, when they were going from Babylon, which Babylon would be kind of right here, and Susa would be back over this way. But this is about a 1,000 to 1,200 mile distance to travel. So one of the things that you also think about is when Nehemiah getting permission means you're going 1,200 miles, and this area in the middle here is a desert. And in fact, just kind of an interesting piece of history, I think it was Darius. If I recall, Darius was one of Cyrus's sons. Maybe I'm the other way around. But anyway, one of the kings, his father was assassinated. And instead of going around, which would have taken a set amount of time, he crossed the desert and arrived about a month ahead of time or something and was able to secure his kingdom before the other guy got all his pieces in play. But huge cost. But that cutting through that desert was extremely dangerous. But this would be the route that they would take. And just on another side note, in Jeremiah, I believe it's in the first couple of chapters, it talks about a pot boiling in the north and tipping over towards the south and spilling over the Holy Land, the Promised Land. That image comes from, because when the Babylonian, the Assyrian army would come, they always came down from the north. And so that boiling pot, they just started conquering, moving south. So in Jeremiah, when he's predicting that, that's why he predicts it that way. But this would be roughly the route that they would take. It was a bit treacherous. Ezra went without protection and was able to escape the ambushes. It says Nehemiah, when he went, the king sent a military with him. So Nehemiah got a different kind of... Ezra had protection by God through prayer and maybe revealing plots against him or ambushes or whatever. Nehemiah had protection because God sent a military with him. God was in charge of it either way, but you just see how this moved forward here. So he moved forward doing these things. He gets to Jerusalem here in chapter 12, or in chapter 2, verse 11. So I came to Jerusalem, was there 3 days. I arose in the night, I and a few men with me. I did not tell anyone what my God was putting into my mind to do. For Jerusalem, and there was no animal with me except the animal on which I was riding. So I went out at night by the valley gate, in the direction of the Dragon's Well, and to the refuse gate, inspecting the walls of Jerusalem, which were broken down, and its gates which were consumed by fire. Then I passed on to the fountain gate and the king's pool, but there was no place for my mount to pass. So I went up by night by the ravine and inspected the wall and entered the valley gate again and returned. So he gives this route that he took, and I'll just kind of show you on this. This gate right here, this is the valley gate. So you'd go out into that valley, and so he's traveling around this way. This area here would be probably what it says the Dragon's Pool or Dragon's Well. That's your kind of that. It might be known as the Pool of Siloam now, I believe. But you go down through that way. Right here, this is the refuse gate. Does anyone know why it's called the refuse gate and how it became that?
Where the sacrificial bodies dumped.
Where everything was dumped. Not during the pagan days, actually. So if you go kind of this way, this is what they call the Valley of Hinnom. In the Valley of Hinnom is where the shrine to Molech was, where they'd go burn their children. In the days of Hezekiah and Josiah, I think Josiah actually, he desecrated the Valley of Hinnom to such an extent that Molech would never be worshipped there again. So he burned the bones of the dead priests on the idol, and then he tore the whole thing down, and they started throwing their garbage out there and all their dead bodies. So Jesus talked about it and called it Gehenna, where the worm never dies and the fire never goes out. That's because that's where they took all these, all the garbage. Basically, it was a garbage dump, and they'd burn it out there, but it started being the refuse gate and being the place where you'd burn it in order to desecrate the place of Molech worship. So that's just kind of an interesting side note. But that's where the refuse gate was, and kind of gives you the area which they would go out. So he goes out by the refuse gate, travels along the wall right here. This is the fountain gate right here. As you can see, there's all these structures in there. Likely, those things got knocked down and his horse couldn't ride by. So he says he went around by the valley, on foot, likely coming around this way. This area here, kind of right in this area, this is what they call the Kidron Valley. So you go down the Kidron Valley, and up the other side is the Mount of Olives. And on this side is the temple, and in Solomon's time, this corner here was called the pinnacle, or the portico of Solomon, but it would be the pinnacle of the temple, the highest point. That's where Satan tempted Jesus to throw himself off. So it just kind of gives you a point of reference. But it seems to me, some people think he went out and turned around and went back. My thinking is Nehemiah went out, and when he couldn't ride his mount anymore, he just walked it, hoofed it the rest of the way, basically because he had a plan on exactly what to do. I'm thinking he probably investigated the whole rest of the wall. However, this is the areas that was discussed in this passage. So he goes out and looks. Interesting thing, he doesn't tell anyone what he's wanting to do. Nehemiah knows if he says, I want to rebuild the wall, here's what we need to do. And it wasn't a description of what needed to be done, the people would know, and he would be discredited. You know, if someone comes and tells you, let's just say, I work on cars a little bit. And I go talk to someone who is a very skilled mechanic, and I tell him, my car has a problem, here's what I think it is, here's what I'm going to do to fix it, and it's completely wrong. What's he going to know about me right away? This guy's clueless. Like, he doesn't know what he's talking about. And he's probably not going to want to go into business with me. Right? Because I really don't know how to work on cars. And Nehemiah knows that's the case. And so a good leader never asks a question he doesn't know the answer to already. So he goes out and he looks at things. He does an assessment of what needs to be done. And so when he goes and asks the question, you see what kind of a situation we're in. He can actually speak to that. He actually knows. There's a proverb that says, it's wisdom to investigate a whole matter before speaking. And really, that's what you see Nehemiah doing. He's investigating the whole matter before speaking. So as he goes and does this, he comes back, and he had a group of people that was his confidants, probably the coalition he made back in Susa. They came with him. A few men went with him. But he didn't tell anyone in Jerusalem what he was doing. In verse 16 it says, the officials did not know where I had gone or what I had done, nor had I as yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, or the rest who did the work. Then I said to them, you see the bad situation we are in, that Jerusalem is desolate and its gates are burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem so that we will no longer be a reproach. So just stop right there. My guess is he is sparing the details to whoever in the memoir. He says, here's the situation we're in. And he probably described it in detail to give himself some leadership credibility. And then he probably said, here's how I want to fix it. Here's what we're going to do. We see a description of what he did. But you see him, he knew he had a plan before he addressed the people, which is an important thing. Verse 18, I told them how the hand of my God had been favorable to me, and about how the king's words, which he had spoken to me, then they said, let us arise and build. Interesting. Just a note point. When he was addressing the king, he asked God, then he asked the king. He sought God's permission, then he sought the king's permission. He tells the people about it. What's he say? Here's what God did, here's what the king said. God allowed me to be able to do this. The king gave me permission. And so why are those two things important here?
The obvious answer to me is that, first of all, if you don't have God's approval to do it, it ain't going to fly. And then God allows works on the king to actually give you the physical things that you need to do in the process. The king is a tool by God.
Yeah.
Yeah, as my grandpa was saying, I kind of follow along the lines of what they needed God's approval, but I feel like the king approval was for more of like a physical worry, because while they did have permission from God, some people might still be on the thought of, well, we do have permission from this, what if the king himself comes down and says, no, just tear it down, stop doing this. And so that's probably why he said that, more of the people were still stuck in physical.
Yeah, I mean, there's two permissions you really need. Now, if we go back to the introduction, why was the gates burned with fire and the walls knocked down? Because King Artaxerxes wrote a decree that they needed to stop their work, and the guys who sent it, Rehum, or whatever his name was, he sent his military and stopped it by force, likely burned the gates with fire and knocked down the walls. So the king said, stop what you're doing and nobody start until I issue a decree. That's in Ezra chapter 4, I think 17 through 26. So the king already made that decree. So if they're going to start working again, they need a decree by the king to start, because that was the thing. And so they would be looking for that. But in addition to that, the reason why they were hit like that in the first place is because they had continued in the sin that Ezra addressed, they continued in. And Ezra said, if we continue in this, then we're going to be hit again. And they were. So you see the two things. What two things happened? Well, first, they were unfaithful to God, and God removed their blessing. And then they were unfaithful to the king, and the king removed their blessing. And those two things happened and stopped their progress and caused them to be in a bad situation. Now fortunes are being reversed. God has blessed Nehemiah to come and rebuild the wall and given him success. And the king has also written the proper permissions. And so you see he's just telling them and encouraging them. Because they're enemies, the first thing they're going to say, are you going to rebel against the king? They can have confidence, no, we're not, and we can resist this enemy because of what Nehemiah says here. So this is a critical thing. But for us as a church and as Christians who want to serve God, these two things are important for us as well. Is to make sure we have our, I don't know if you would say legal necessarily, but in part legal house in order, and then also our spiritual house in order. You know, there are things that we need in order to move forward, you know, and part of it is from God, and part of it is from the situation we happen to be in, and their situation involved the king. So, the end of verse 18, they put their hands to the good work. So Nehemiah said they started doing the good work. So immediately, Nehemiah gets some opposition. Now, I use these two guys because Sanballat and Tobiah, they're pretty much the team on this. And so I was looking for some bad guys, and these guys popped up, and I thought, you know, this is probably it. And just so you know, Tobiah is this guy right here. Just you know, that's Tobiah, the tall one. So but in my mind anyway, that's Tobiah. So Sanballat and Tobiah, Sanballat the Horonite, verse 19, and Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard it, and they mocked us and despised us and said, "What is this thing you're doing? Are you rebelling against the king?" So here you see them. So you have Sanballat and Tobiah. Geshem would be so they were officials of some sort in the Sumerian area. It seems like Geshem, if you look through other scriptures, he was going to be more down from Edom in that area. And so they're building this coalition that surrounds Judea, and saying, we're opposing your work. But notice what it says. They mocked us and despised us. Now, that's what they were doing, and here's what they said. What is this thing you're doing? Are you going to rebel against the king? And I emphasize the you. You guys? No, wait a minute, you're joking, right? Like, you're going to do that. You know, it's kind of like, if, you know, I thought about like, you have the skinny guy standing up to the bully, and he's like, you're going to take me on? Seriously? Like, you're going to hurt yourself, right? And that's kind of the thing, is that they're just discrediting them. And what you'll see throughout this narrative, there's this discrediting, this mocking, like, these guys can't do anything. They're a bunch of trash, is really, and that's kind of the tone that they're taking. These guys are a bunch of trash. They can't do anything. What are they going to do? You're going to rebel against the king. You can't even, like, you know, you could hardly, you know, punch yourself out of a wet paper bag, kind of. That's kind of the idea, is you're just mocking them about their own weakness, which may be true. They were discouraged and disheartened, and they probably couldn't do it for themselves. But notice how Nehemiah turns the narrative. He doesn't say, we can do it and I'll prove it to you. Instead, he answers them and says, the God of heaven will give us success. It's not because of us. We are too weak. And in fact, later on, they're going to sing a song, we're too weak to do any of this work. That's going to be their song. We're too weak. The burden bearers are failing, and we're not enough. What does that mean? We're completely dependent on God. And that's what Nehemiah acknowledges. It's like, yeah, it doesn't matter because we have God on our side. We don't need to be strong enough. We have God on our side. And that was his answer. Therefore, God, the God of heaven will give us success. Therefore, we, his servants, will arise and build. You have no portion, right, or memorial in Jerusalem. And you're not going to have any part of it. I don't need your help. I don't want your help. I have God to help me. And that's all I need. So now, let's talk about Nehemiah's plan. Because that's how he approached the opposition. That's how Zerubbabel did it at first. And then he backed out and became kind of squishy, and they quit building their temple for 15 years. Nehemiah, he has had none of it. He's like, we're going to do it. It doesn't matter what you say. God's on our side. And now we see his plan. And as you look at this plan, there's two things that I find interesting about it. Or a few things I find interesting about it. The first one is these people are not wall builders. You see perfumers. Now, if I think of manly professions, and I could be wrong, this could just be totally my chauvinistic point of view, whatever. Perfumer does not seem to me like a very manly profession. You know, it seems like more of an office job, so to speak. My son makes fun of me for having an office job, and I used to do construction, and I'd always tease my dad about how soft his hands were. Because, you know, my dad he was a Boeing worker, he was an accountant basically, and his hands were super soft. Now my hands are probably softer than his, so now where does that put me? So I know where I stand in all this, so I'm just being, but you've got perfume workers, you have this guy, and his name was Shania or whatever, and his daughters, they actually built a huge portion of the wall. But I was thinking about this. And the thing that stands out to me, these were not masons. They were not wall builders. But Nehemiah used them to build a wall. And I think this is a critical thing. Is that he was wise in how he did it. We'll talk about that for a minute. But he delegated. You know, my tendency is, I want to be there and do it myself because I know how to do it, but I don't know if you do. So I don't want to have to go back and redo it. And so I tend to want to do it, and that was something when in my younger years I had to learn, is if someone else is in charge, see, my way, I know it works. So when I was doing construction, I was good at it, and I knew my way worked, and I wanted everyone to do it just like me. Turns out, people didn't always do it like me, and their way worked too. And you have to trust them to lay out the parameters and trust them to do it well. And that's something I had to learn because I really wanted to have that control. And I realized these guys are doing it so much different than me, but they get the same result. In fact, they're fast. They're good. But they're just not they do it different than me. And then you realize, okay, my way may not be the only way. That was a surprise to me at some point in my life, I think. And maybe even now, from time to time, teaching my kids to do stuff, they do things different than me. And I always feel like, no, you got to do it this way. And then I realize, no, his ways work, or it's working too. So you got to learn that. But Nehemiah was a good leader, and he knew that. I need this wall built, and I'm going to ask them to do it, and I'm going to trust them that they'll do the best they can. Because that's the thing, is you weren't going to build this whole wall unless you had everybody involved. And it's just fascinating to me because this is the way a church works, isn't it? Sometimes we need to get some things done, and not everyone's qualified to do it, but it still needs to be done. If we don't use people, then we're not going to have as much success. And Nehemiah, he had a lot of success because he used people. So you start going through this, and what you start seeing is Nehemiah used people. You'll see that he brought people in from the surrounding area. So I have this red circle. This is kind of generally the areas that people traveled to Jerusalem. Samaria, you see, is up north, and just to give you a point of reference, in a straight line, that's 50 miles. I don't know if you could take a direct route, but that's basically a 50-mile distance there. to Samaria. So that's where Sanballat and Tobiah were kind of from. But it also you see a commercial threat coming from them. But as we look at this, the organization is impressive. And this is where Nehemiah really excelled. A few things he did. He had people work on the wall that was near their house. 2 reasons why. Because if it breaks, who fixes it? So you're going to want to do a good job. If it fails, whose house gets sacked first? You're going to want to do a good job. Now there's some wisdom in that. Even if I'm not a wall builder, I'm going to make sure that if I put a brick down there, it's going to be at least enough to resist something. I'm not going to do terrible work. So there's some wisdom in that. But when Nehemiah lays out, here's what we did, and chapter 3 is all about here's what we did, it's interesting because if you read through there, you'll see, you have verse 1, the sheep gate, verse 3, the fish gate, verse 6, the old gate, verse 8, the broad wall, verse 11, the tower of the furnaces. He goes through and he says, here's all these locations. I'll just kind of take you through. This is the sheep gate. It's in the temple. That's where the priest would bring in the sheep, and the priest built the sheep gate. That's where near their home. You travel around this way, over here, this is the fish gate. It's called the fish gate because the road from the sea came up on that side, and so they'd bring the fish in over there. You come around this way, the tower of the furnaces and the broad wall. This wall right here, that's the broad wall. So you can just kind of see the pattern from the broad wall. I believe you have a couple of patches through here. Here's the valley gate. This is the section that the daughters built, I believe. And then he comes down here to this pool, and then you have the refuse gate. And he just goes along the city, talks about the angle. I believe this is probably the angle. Here, in this part of the wall over here, I believe this section here was built by people from out of town. And then a section over on this side of the wall was built by the same group of people. And you just come around, here's names the tower. But it just says, here's very organized and structured. A lot of times it says this guy built the wall by his house, this guy built the wall by his house, this guy built this section here, or these guys from out of town in Jericho, they built this section over here. But he had it all planned and delegated, and when they were going to build the wall, you just see some organization and structure in what Nehemiah did. And I think this is, there's a few interesting things there. Is he got a coalition together again. He allowed people without the skill set to work on it, but he put them in a place where they would have a dog in the fight for doing a good job. He didn't say go travel across the city and do it. And that's another thing, is when they're working by their home, it's pretty easy to put in a little extra work because you don't have any travel time. All your resources are close by. If you want to go make lunch, you can go to your house and make lunch. So there's some wisdom in not having people crisscross the city and all that. And then another element to it that was helpful is the walls were broken down and burned, but you could pretty much scrounge up a lot of the material you'll need to rebuild the wall laying around near the place where you're fixing. So this just kind of gives us a point of reference on that. We'll go ahead and stop there. In chapter 4, what we're going to see is the opposition being ratcheted up. But just in this is we can just see some real wisdom and pointers in leadership. This is what good leadership looks like. And it's one of those things you think about it is, if we as a church, we have things we need to get done, this is how a lot of times it's going to look. Is we just need to pray about it, make preparations, seek God's permission, seek the other permissions we need, and then move forward. When we move forward, do it in a very organized and thoughtful way. And so you see wisdom and faith coming together in order to produce success. And that's what Nehemiah did here. Any thoughts or comments before we close? All right, if not, let's close in a word of prayer. Our most gracious God and Father in heaven, we are so blessed to be able to look at what Nehemiah did and learn from it, dear Lord. We ask, God, that this would be a guide to us and that we would be like Nehemiah, where no matter what we face, we would approach it in a manner that recognizes you first, dear Lord. We pray, Lord, that as we have various successes in our life and in this congregation, that we would be sure to attribute those successes to you, and that we would say frequently that the good hand of our God was upon us. And we pray these things in your Son's name, Jesus the Christ. Amen.
Amen.